productivity issues then. Okay,
yes.
okay, okay.
Okay, that's it for the nature of economic development.
Okay.
All right, before that, just wanted to say lah, the most important thing in the first part is that you need to understand that economic development is multidimensional and is multifaceted, meaning to say that it doesn't just rely on one single part. It doesn't just rely on one single figure for us to evaluate how economic development is. And anyway, to evaluate that, we have to move on to indicators.
Okay, so like I said, to measure the economic development doesn't just rely on one figure. I mean, there are many types of measures to assess economic development. So they are called single indicators, which is defined by solitary measures used to assess growth and or development of a country. So these indicators are used to measure the development of a country. So the first type is there are three or more types of single indicators. So number one is financial measures. So this is when we measure the economic development using financial measures. An example of those is GDP per capita, GNI per capita, or GDP or GNI per capita at purchasing power parity. Second type of indicators is by measuring health. So we can measure health by calculating the life expectancy at birth or infant mortality rate. Number three, we can also measure the development of a country using education measures by knowing the expected years of schooling and mean years of schooling. And lastly, we can also measure the development of a country by referring to the economic or social inequality indicators or energy indicators or environmental indicator. So I will explain in the next slides. So for financial measures, like I mentioned, the example of financial measures to measure the economic development is number one, GDP per capita figures. So as we know, GDP is the total of all economic activity in a country, regardless of who owns the productive assets divided by the number of population. So it is basically GDP is GDP is a number that expresses the worth of the country's output in local currency. And it also represents the monetary value of all the goods and services produced within that country. And usually, since the definition goes since it is usually calculated for a specific period of time, for example, in 1 year or in a quarter of a year. Meanwhile, GNI per capita figures is defined by total income that is earned by a country's factors of production, regardless of where the assets are located, divided by the number in population. So basically, GNI is a measure of wealth by calculating income instead of output. When GDP, they measure output, GNI, it measures the income of a country. And it can be calculated by adding the foreign income sources to gross domestic product. And usually nations that have a high foreign direct investment, they will show a significant difference between GNI and GDP. So for example, in the US, the GNI in 2019 was like $87 trillion. But the GDP was the GNI in 2019 was 87.5 trillion, but the GDP was 87.6. So there's a difference there. For GNI, we can also calculate it at purchasing power parity exchange rate. And that is when we equate the purchasing power of currencies in different countries. And you can calculate by comparing the prices of identical goods and services in different countries. So to explain more about purchasing power parity, it's a way to compare economic productivity and standards of living between countries. So according to this concept, the currencies you want to compare tu macam sama. So macam mana, like when macam a basket of goods is priced the same. Sekejap. They compare different currencies through the baskets of goods approach, if you remember. Okay, tak apa, moving on. Sekejap, before that, faham tak so far?
So which one is more accurate between GDP per capita and GNI per capita?
Based from my reading, it's GNI per capita because GNI is the measure of income of the country instead of output. So it's more specific to that country. And Jima asked beza. Okay. Jima kata GDP is income include foreign profit but not our profit overseas. But GNI is income not include foreign profit but include our profit. Yes, because GNI measures the income of a country rather than the output. Okay.
Kenapa your slide macam blank sekejap tadi? Ke mata teacher yang blank sekejap tadi?
Dia memang macam tu, teacher.
Okay.
Internet
Can we-
college teacher.
No wonder. Teacher pun kat college. Kejap kita tengok GNI per capita figures at purchasing power parity. This is only, this one is very useful when we make comparisons between countries. So it will be the GNI per capita, but we are looking at purchasing power parity. So it means that, so if we, even though GNI or GDP per capita at a normal range, if we consider purchasing power parity, so we are actually investigating what would be the worth value of value of the goods and services of the same thing in GNI and GDP between countries. So that one at purchasing power parity or PPP is the most accurate measures if we make comparisons between countries. Okay, so let's move on to the next one.
So under GNI, there is also foreign direct investment that will affect the GNI figure. So foreign direct investment is the substantial investments made by a company into a foreign concern. Okay, so just to give general info, like in this century, there's an increase in the flow of FDI, and in developing country economies, they never mind, Annie. Okay, so in developing countries, when it has a large amount of FDI, the GDP figure will be higher than its GNI figures. Meanwhile, when developed country has large amount of FDI, GDP figure will be lower than GNI figure. So for developing countries, GDP will be higher than GNI because it includes profit that have been repatriated. So repatriated means sending back to the country, the profit. Yeah, the profit will be sent back to the original country because since GDP, they include the income for all economic activity, including the foreign countries. So that's why it must be deducted because the money will be sent to the original home country. So that's why the repatriated profits don't remain in the country's economy, and so they can't be used to make contributions to the country's progress. This is the main reason. By the way, GDP can be used to make contributions to the country's progress. So that's why GNI figures tend to be used to measure the status of developing countries. So for developed countries, the GDP is, when the FDI is high, GDP will be less than GNI because they include profit that have been repatriated.
Repeat kejap. Ulang balik kejap.
Macam mana, teacher?
Yang you cakap tadi tu. Ulang sikit.
For developed countries, when FDI is high, the GDP will be lower than GNI because it includes. Kenapa macam sama?
Dia macam ni sebenarnya dekat developing country, FDI tu maksudnya macam investment lah. Developing country kan banyak resources kan. So developed country ni dia akan banyak invest dekat negara tu. Okay, so itu menyebabkan dia punya GDP dia higher sebab dia akan include output yang diproduce dalam negara tu.
GDP
Tapi
mana? Sekejap. GDP mana Hazimah? Country mana?
developing countries.
Developing countries. Okay. Then?
So JNI dia lagi kurang lah sebab sebenarnya dia punya output, dia punya income dia tu bukannya banyak pun, tapi sebabkan negara lain yang banyak invest dalam dia, sebab tu dia punya GDP dia tinggi. So dia terbalik pula dengan developed country. Developed country ni dia banyak invest dekat dalam negara developing country. So GDP dia selalunya lagi rendah daripada JNI dia. Tapi
Ini example country Hazimah. Senang sikit orang boleh faham.
Kalau developing country, contoh kita boleh ambil South Africa. Kalau developed country, contoh kita boleh ambil UK. So UK ni selalu invest dekat South Africa. So South Africa tu dia punya JNI dia lagi rendah daripada GDP sebab sebenarnya total output dia pun bukan banyak sangat pun. Okay, kalau UK pula dia punya GNI dia lagi tinggi sebab dia akan include dia punya income daripada overseas. Okay, faham tak? Lepas tu selalunya developing country ni kan banyak orang akan kerja dekat luar negara sebab nak dapat income yang lebih banyak. So selalunya GNI dia orang ni macam mana, lagi tinggi sebab banyak orang bawa balik remittance tu dalam dia. Nampak?
Okay. Kalau kita tengok chat, thank you. Ellie tanya what's a foreign concern, talking about foreign investments. Talking about the foreign concern could be the host country yang ada investment daripada luar ataupun dia yang buat investment depending on which country you are referring to. Yang Hazimah tu cakap tu betul. Okay, you have to bear in mind semua ni akan masuk dalam balance of payments. Okay, the first time kita masuk akan jadi financial inflow, right? In our finance punya account, capital accounts-nya tu. Okay, tapi bila kita dah masuk, dah operate in about a year or 2 years where we generate profits, so the profits tu or the dividends tu kita buat balik is repatriated back to their home countries yang tadi. So the balance for payments is the financial transactions. Tapi the action adalah based on balance of payments and of course we do have the consequences after that. Okay. Any other things we would like to discuss? Kalau tidak kita continue. Okay then, continue.
Okay, so like I mentioned, for developed countries, the GNI will be higher than GDP. So this suggests that they earn earnings from assets owned abroad. Like Jima said, contoh UK has apa example Jima dekat negara South Africa. So they earn income from South Africa because they have investments there. So when you see a negative figure in the final column on the right here, on the right, it indicates a negative flow in terms of net property income from abroad. So in contrast, for developing countries, the GDP will be higher than GNI. So this suggests that there is significant earnings from assets leaving the countries to go abroad. Okay. So example of example of developed country, as you can see here, is UK. So as you can see, the GNI is higher than GDP. So GNI dia kalau tengok 40,600, but the GDP is 39,900. An example of developing countries, contoh kat sini is Botswana, Cameroon, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So as you can see, for India, the GDP is higher than GNI. 1.9K for GDP, but 1.7 for GNI. Okay, moving on. There is also something called remittance. remittance inflows in developing countries, and remittance is basically they come from worker remittances, which means the money is sent home to the country by workers who are abroad. So I think the most relatable example here in Malaysia is people from the country, foreign countries come to our country and they can send money to their home country from their earnings here. So usually for developing countries, it is a significant figure because usually people from developing countries yang go to developed countries untuk work there. But for developed countries, remittance inflow is very low, just less than 1%. They make up less than 1% of GDP.
There could be remittance outflow
Oh, huh?
Country yang ada huge remittance outflow. Developed nations.
Oh, okay. So developed nations will have a
Remittance
huge
outflow.
remittance outflows.
Uh-uh.
So usually the sender of the remittance is a foreign worker and the recipient is relative back home. And remittance also represent one of the largest sources for people in low income and developing nations. Okay, moving on.
Sekejap. Country mana yang ada banyak remittance outflow, yang developed nation yang you boleh fikir?
Developed nation. Oh.
Canada boleh teacher?
Boleh, tapi jiran Kanada tu lagi banyak.
US.
UK teacher.
UK ada juga. Habis if you're looking for job opportunities between US and UK, which one is more welcoming of foreigners?
UK, US, US.
US is more welcoming of foreigners compared to UK, right? So they have all sorts of people working in US, and because of that they having huge remittance keluar. So kita pun banyak remittance keluar, but in term of value may not as much as the US. Country yang banyak remittance inflows apa? ASEAN countries.
Cambodia.
Apa?
Cambodia.
Tak banyak sangat.
Kalau
Remittance.
Indonesia teacher.
Indonesia
Ya.
kurang banyak. Country lain.
Philippines.
Ya. Kenapa Philippines?
China, teacher?
Oh, Philippines
China.
banyak expats teacher.
Philippines banyak expert or semi skill. Yang kecil. So, macam Philippines, they have a lot of their locals, a lot of Filipinos actually working outside, and most of them at least semi-skilled workers or semi-skilled, and they have a lot of skilled workers, expatriates. So meaning that bila they work with their skill, a semi-skilled or a skilled worker, you can anticipate the value of their earnings overseas, abroad. And they also be able to bring a huge sum sent balik to your back home, to the home country. So if talking about Cambodia, Indonesia, maybe Myanmar, whatever, yes, there are a lot of people, a lot of immigrants working in Malaysia, whatever, right? But since they are immigrants with slow skills, or maybe some of them are semi-skilled, but not as high as in Philippines. So means that the value of money sebenarnya, if they were to bring in their earnings, Filipinos will bring the highest numbers. Sebab the wages itself, their salary itself is higher compared to other countries, right? So what's in the chat cakap? Okay, what about Malaysia? Remittance kita banyak ke tak ada? Ke sikit? Any idea about Malaysia?
Maybe banyak teacher.
Banyak? Banyak ke orang Malaysia je kat luar? Ada juga kan? Banyak? Banyak? Dia kata banyak, siapa ni? Boleh.
Sorry teacher.
Apa yang banyak tu? Yang you kata banyak Malaysian kerja kat luar.
Saya fikir high skill people yang kerja kat luar.
Luar macam kat Singapura ke?
Singapura dengan UK or US.
Boleh juga lah. Tapi kalau you go by number, I would say Philippines will be the top one lah. Sebab Philippines memang Philippines country encourage their citizens to get work outside Philippines. So dia memang encourage kalau tak ada kerja pergi ke luar. Okay, let's move on.
Tanya,
Mhm.
kenapa remittance tu dia kira as GDP bukan GNI?
Remittance tu hasil kerja dekat country tu sendiri. Mana you dapat duit, you kerja dekat country tu. So you are participating in the production of the goods and services in the country. So by definition GDP adalah all the goods and services produced in that country. So that's why dia masuk dalam GDP. Does that answer your question, Zima?
Jadi kalau ikut table ni,
Mm-hmm.
yang lagi tinggi maksudnya?
Lagi tinggi, lagi banyak, dia banyak the citizens working outside. Macam Tonga, they have more Tonga people working outside of Tonga. So that's why remittance inflow to Tonga is the highest. Kan? Yang Siberia tak ramai, tak sebanyak country lain. Remittance inflow. So remittance inflow means that ramai citizen kerja kat luar. Kerja kat luar ramai, but also you have to times in term of value their skills. Kalau ramai je tapi immigrants low skill, so value dia yang dia boleh bawa balik tu tak banyak lah compare tu yang banyak.
Okay, faham teacher.
Okay. Okay, let's move on.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, there is purchasing power parity rate, and that is what we calculate because there is a problem when making financial comparisons between countries. This is because the goods and services don't cost the same amount in different countries, and the purchasing power of a person's income will be different. So it's hard to compare when you're comparing different things. So that's why you calculate the PPP to macam samakan the currencies, I guess, in a way. So for example, a loaf of bread costs less in India than in Austria, and when we convert Indian GNI per capita into US dollars, we get $1,700. However, in $1,790 has higher purchasing power in India than it would in Austria, because things cost less. Okay, so that's why to solve this problem, we calculate the PPP exchange rate. So this is to get a more valid figure for making judgments about the ability of people to meet their basic needs. Also because also this exchange rate, they attempt to equate purchasing power of currencies in different countries, and it's calculated by comparing prices of identical goods and services in different countries. So yeah, setakat tu faham tak?
Okay.
Right. Move on. So the second single indicator is health measures. Number one, the first example of health measures is number one, life expectancy at birth. So life expectancy at birth is the measure of average number of years that a person may expect to live from the time they are born. Basically, kita anggap how long that person will live for. And just to tell you, the factors that lead to a relatively high life expectancy figure is when we have good level of healthcare and health services. We have provision of clean water, adequate sanitation, provision of nationwide education, reasonable supplies of food, healthy diets and lifestyles, low levels of poverty, and lack of conflict. So these factors, they affect how long that person lives. Basically, basically to live a long life, you need to have your basic needs met lah. So the second example of health measures is infant
So before that,
mortality.
how long is our Malaysian life? How long are we expected to live in this world?
65 years old ni je. 60.
Is it based on facts ke?
Saya agak.
Mana boleh, cuba cari life expectancy. Cuba yang lain cari. Humaira tengah buat presentation kan. Yang lain cuba cari nanti inform teacher. Malaysian life expectancy. Kita ni dekat 70 lebih ke 80?
76.36 years.
76. Lama lagi nak hidup kan teacher? Kau muda lagi kan? Okay, continue.
Okay, so the second example of health measures is infant mortality rate. So it's a measure of the number of deaths of babies under ages of 1 year per 1,000 lives birth given a year. So basically, they did not measure how many number of babies die in 1 year per 1,000 of lives.
Every 1,000 kan?
Every 1,000. So usually, the infant mortality rate is affected by level of healthcare and health services, availability of clean water and sanitation, availability of food, and level of poverty. So usually, maybe in developing countries or third world countries, the infant mortality rate is high because the no access to these basic needs. Yeah. Also, infant mortality rate do not include babies that are born dead. So the babies have to live, but under the age of 1 year lah. Maknanya tak lah lahir dah meninggal terus calculated in infant mortality rate. Dia kena live for a few months or a few weeks first. Okay. Next.
Lepas tu kan nak add on kan, ada soalan pernah keluar pasal health measure ni. Dia tanya why life expectancy at birth is one of the indicators used to measure economic development. So kena faham lah kenapa dia one of the indicator used to measure economic development, and then you can answer yang dia indicate the healthcare of a country and then healthcare ni is one of the measure of economic development. Thanks, explain. Okay, itu je.
Thank you, Lima.
Okay, untuk single indicator yang seterusnya, education measures. So education measures is to help monitoring the level of participation in education, such as enrollment, particularly at what age the group to identify the scope for improvement in major aspects of education. This is one of the UNDP goals, which is to ensure the inclusive and equitable quality education and also to promote lifelong learning opportunities. And education measure is also signifies the importance of measuring education level and to inform the policymakers in pursuit of the country's development and improvements in all aspects of education. It will facilitate the countries to meet the UNDP goals so that you be higher in labor market participation and productivity needed for economic growth and development. And plus, this can help to reduce the poverty and hunger in the long run. Okay, next. So, next slide. So there are two types of education measures: expected years of schooling and also mean years of schooling. So what is expected years of schooling? It is a measure of the years of schooling that a child of school entrance age may expect to receive, and mean years of schooling is a measure of the average years of schooling that have been received by those people in the economy who are aged 25 years and over.
Kalau kita go by expected years of schooling and means years of schooling to what does in the middle means that? We expect people to study until Form 5, is it right? But what does let's say the mean years of schooling is until Form 3. What does it mean?
Tak faham, teacher.
It means many students are not able to get the education that they need.
Ya, ataupun drop out cases of schools tinggi. Right? Sebab we expect student at least sampai Form 5, but ramai yang PCK is ada dropouts or they decided not to. And so also is indicate the potential workforce. Kalau kita punya average means kita tak sama dengan expected, then we can tell what's productivity level of our workforce nanti. Okay, continue.
Okay, next slide. Okay, what are the other single indicators? Firstly, economic or social inequality indicator. This would be measures in areas such as income and wealth distribution, pay inequality, asset ownership, and access to credit. Um, mm, oh. Sekejap, Okay, tak apa. Next indicator, pay inequality means.
Before we go to next indicator, kita borak sikit pasal yang tadi tu.
Oh.
Okay. Economic social inequality, because masa pun dah nak time ya, kita discuss. Okay, measure in terms of income wealth distribution. So we're talking about income, then this is where you go by in terms of like financial backgrounds, or this is what we Malaysians categorize into B40, M40 or T20, right? The below 40, mediums, and the top 20. Okay, and so when we do that, then we can see that how many people, percentage of the people living in a B40, how many percentage living in T20. So it also indicates if we know the percentage of people living in B40 and T20, it in a way to give a good idea of wealth distributions. Or we can also talking about the rich and the poor, right? So if we have, like, for example, let's say that our T20 represents 1%. So we do have like 1% of the populations are the very rich people, right? And then so let's presume we have B40 is like 60 people are in a B40. So we can expect that the low income people, the sufferings will become the majority of the populations. Okay. Maybe it's not 40, not 60, could be 40 or even 30. So what does it mean that this is where the governments need to cater for those in the low income groups. The governments need to come up with a lot of initiative. Okay. And also that will tell us why is it governments giving dreams all these years? Right, or bantuan sehari hidup, or bantuan prihatin, or what sort. Okay, in the old days, we don't have this stuff in terms of your allowance, cash flow, cash transfer given to the public, right? And what do you expect of now during pandemic times? Distributions of those people who actually before or even fall into poverty line. Okay, so, and that will tell us about the income. And when talking about incomes, it tells us about their ability to buy materials for the material standard of living. Okay, or maybe their money is just enough for the basics ones, what not. Okay, and then wealth distribution. So wealth is something that you don't, or is either you do or you don't have. So if you do, then it will be easier, but also talking about you will not be very much affected. But if you have nothing, so you are just starting from scratch. So that actually indicates your finance status. Okay, pay inequality in some areas, in some countries, there are different pay inequality. Even though you are the same qualifications, you'll be given slightly different payments. Okay, it could be because of gender issues, or it could be because race issues, or it could be because of favoritisms. Okay, so if we have a more established labor law, pay inequality is being under control because the law indicate that you should not discriminate people. Okay, if the labor law of the country is not established or is not been fully monitored, then we could have the pay inequality. Right? So you working for long hours, and yes, your pay, your at the end of the month, you getting the same hours with your friends yang actually go by the basic working hours compared to you working very long hours sampai malam pun. Okay. Okay, and asset ownership sama dengan wealth is kaya, is it right? Orang kaya. Asset means that orang kaya harta lah. So right, it could be lands, it could be building and so on. Wealth could be it could be you're very much rich people simply because you have shares, you have stocks and so on. Financial matters. Okay, last one, access to credit. So when you have access to credit, basically you can actually purchase items, you can actually have a good and services, and we pay them on credit. So this is like credit cards and so on. Okay, and so usually these are the youngsters. In also referring to this, access to credit also influence the public consumption abilities. So for Malaysia, we kind of easy to get credits, and we do have a lot of problems later on in terms of so many youngsters that fail to pay credit cards and have to file for bankruptcy. Okay, so this is a serious matter kalau tak boleh control. Okay, teacher tak intend nak move on to the next slide, so we end our session today. We continue again tomorrow. Okay, before that, any other questions? So far, okay ke follow?
Okay.
Okay, teacher.
Okay, then. Okay, so